Welcome. We are going to be studying, I'm going to be commenting on Livingston chapter 14 today, which is all about secularization, new religious revitalization movements, contemporary religious fundamentalism. Anyway, what I want to do here, rather than going through the text laboriously, is I want to introduce some concepts. First off, and most of them are talked about in the text. So I can find my mouse here. Here we go. Put me over in the corner. Most of them are talked about in the text, but I'm adding a couple that aren't. First of all, the text does talk about modernization. And when we talk about modernization, that actually encompasses a whole bunch of stuff. In fact, urbanization is actually part of modernization. But modernization is basically the general process through which societies transform economically, socially, culturally, to become more industrial, urban, and secular. Now, when we talk about it in this sense, we're talking about, first of all, when you talk about the vocational, if you will, or the economic, a majority of the population is engaged in industrial and service occupations rather than agriculture. This may seem, as a given today, but, a couple centuries ago, the vast majority of the citizens of most countries are involved in farming. They're involved in some kind of agriculture. And nowadays, the majority of the population lives in urban areas because that's where the occupations are at. And they have to do with industrial production of products, and they have to do with service industries, everything from insurance to banking or whatever. And so this is one of the main features of modernization. A market-driven economy and government bureaucracy, is another feature of it. And scientific and technological innovations are expected and encouraged. Now, this is a little different. When people were living as agriculturalists, a lot of them have lived pretty much the same way for many, many centuries. And it worked the way that they did it, and people were not asking, gosh, isn't there some easier way I could do it? I mean, there ought to be a way that I could do this. We all think this way today. If I'm coming home and my hands are full of groceries, something in me says, man, I ought to be able to say to the door, open, it's me, and the door ought to swing open. Of course, there are people that can afford doors that do that. I can't on my salary, but something in me says that it should be like that. And so this is a very new idea that somehow science is supposed to make our lives more convenient. Technological innovation should allow us to accomplish more, be more productive with less effort. And so these are all aspects of modernization. And again, the term urbanization, the second one here, specifically has to do with the majority of the people living in urban areas rather than rural areas. And obviously they're moving to industrial areas to be involved in those kind of vocations, or they're moving to cities, which is usually somewhere near downtown, is usually where you have most of the service industries based, at least the main offices of them, again, like banking, insurance, and things like that. So, moving on here, let's talk about globalization really quickly here. Globalization, you can probably kind of figure out what it means. It means that all around the globe, all over our world, we have interaction of people, companies, and governments in different nations. These people, companies, and governments are interacting worldwide. And of course, this is facilitated by current communications technology. Now, we're of course in a religious studies course, so we're really concerned with the cultural religious aspects of things. So globalization in this context would mean the linking or the greater awareness of distant cultures. So any process that moves a society toward an internationalization of cultural and religious discourse would fall in the category of globalization. So we know what's going on around the world. It's, in the whole history of civilization, it's fairly recent that we could find out about things, say, going on in Japan or China in a hurry. We can transmit information, in split seconds across the world now. But if a tidal wave had happened in China or Japan, people in North America might not have known about it, for weeks or months until somebody came on a ship and said, by the way, Japan's underwater. So we kind of take this for granted today, but the way that it really affects us culturally, sociologically, religiously, is that we get to observe other cultures, societies, and religions across the world and compare them with our own. Now, what you do with that ability, of course, has to do with what your motivations are. If people are just looking for another reason why they're right and everybody else is wrong, they can certainly find everything they need on the internet to, reinforce their bigoted views based on cherry picking of information that makes their case. On the other hand, if someone, and I hope we all fall in this category, wants to understand how people that are very different from us can find meaning and purpose in their life and so on, and want to understand what it's like to be them, then the internet can be a wonderful opportunity for us to learn all kinds of things. You can make friends with people all over the world. And if you're interested, you could ask them all kinds of questions about, what their life is like, what their priorities are, how religion in some way adds meaning and purpose to their life or legitimates a social structure or whatever. So we as religious studies scholars have a tremendous opportunity. But as I said, there are those who are really trying to somehow assert their superiority and assert the wrongness of anyone that doesn't agree with them. And for them, obviously, they can use the internet to find all the data they need to tell you that everybody but them is somehow wrong. And of course, we don't want to fall in that category. So globalization here. Now, moving on here. Multiculturalism, pluralism. You've heard a lot about diversity and inclusiveness. A recognition of diversity just means we recognize that people are all different. And inclusiveness means that we have some kind of a philosophy that people who are very different from us should be included in something that we both belong to. So what is that something? Well, it can be any kind of a cultural institution. It can be the nation as a whole. So the two terms that I really want to talk about here in relation to this are multiculturalism and pluralism. Now, there are different ways of defining these things. And if you are, of course, talking about religious studies or cultural studies, we might have some different definitions here. But basically, multiculturalism means the coexistence of different peoples and their cultural ways in one time and place. Now, some people would just say that's all it is. Many other people would say that the term implies some kind of acceptance of the multitude of cultures, some kind of appreciation of the cultures, or if not an appreciation of all the cultures themselves, at least an appreciation of the fact that having a society made up of many different cultures is somehow a good thing. It's somehow an advantage, okay? Somehow, the existence of different types of people within the same society is a good thing. Now, we're moving on now into another aspect of this because, again, people will define this in different ways. Some people will say multiculturalism is just a whole bunch of different cultures together, but, they might be in conflict, they might be fighting, whatever. But when you get to pluralism is when you have more of a cooperation. This is not the way I'm going to define multiculturalism, but it leads me into pluralism very easily here. Pluralism is the recognition and affirmation of diversity within a political body. And when I say political, I mean a national body. There is some greater identity to which all of these different multicultures involve. So America is a great example of pluralism. The recognition and recognition and affirmation of diversity within this same nation. And this is seen to permit and guarantee the peaceful coexistence of different interests and lifestyles. So we're talking about a state of society in which members of diverse ethnic, racial, religious, or social groups maintain an autonomous participation in and development of their traditional culture or their special interests. So they have, subcultural communities that are bound together under, somewhat different beliefs or practices than maybe a different culture. However, this is all taking place within the confines of a common civilization. Okay? Sorry, I didn't mean to put that word up there. Within a common civilization. So the idea is that within this civilization, these different cultural identities are protected. They are allowed to exist. Now, we certainly have laws that transcend all of these cultures that everybody has to live by. And if you're breaking the laws, obviously the state, the country is going to punish you for that. But as long as you are living according to the laws of the nation, pluralism guarantees to some degree equal rights for people from very different cultures or very different religions. So to make it real simple here, when we're talking about multiculturalism and pluralism, and again, there's so many different definitions of this, whether you're talking about philosophy or political theory or religion or whatever, but simply multiculturalism would be simply the coexistence of different people and different cultures in one time and place. And there is an idea that there is an acceptance of this diversity and some kind of appreciation of it. You might appreciate some cultures more than another, but you appreciate that we are better having multiple cultures. Pluralism, on the other hand, has more to do with the national identity of everybody, kind of this overarching identity, if you will. And this, in our country, for instance, we are guaranteed the right of freedom of religion and freedom of cultural practices, again, as long as they're not hurting anyone else and they're not breaking the laws of our country. So pluralism is, you can think of it as the philosophy that guarantees the rights of all of these different cultures to be equal in the same society. Now, this is all ideal, and of course, although we might say that we agree with these ideals, we recognize that in society this isn't always the case, and we are constantly pushing forward to try and better live out this philosophy that everybody should have the same rights. And of course, this chapter here, when you talk about religious fundamentalism, religious fundamentalism is very much opposed to the idea of everybody in a multicultural society having the same rights. Whatever rights you have are determined in a fundamentalist society by how right your religious views are. And if your religious views are wrong, then you should not have the same rights. Many fundamentalists would say that homosexuals should not have the right to get married, should not have the right to visit their partners in intensive care in a hospital, should not have the right to put their partners on insurance programs or whatever. And so this would be a case where fundamentalism would very much disagree with the guarantees of pluralism. And again, it's not black and white. It's where you draw the line. Everybody, to some degree, will say that diversity is nice, it's acceptable. But how much are you going to promote it? How much are you going to see this as an advantage and actually look for opportunities to extend equal rights to people with very different viewpoints of your own? Again, if you are a traditionalist, a conservative, a fundamentalist, you are less likely to want to extend those rights to everyone. And the book mentions, I think, a major case. Actually, it wasn't the book. It was something else that I was thinking about putting up, but was mentioning a case where the owner of a bakery was sued because the owner would not make a wedding cake for a gay wedding. And the owner responded by saying, well, you can come in here and you can buy all the cakes and pies and tarts that you want, but you cannot force me to participate in something that I feel violates my religious convictions. And so this is a big discussion, of course, that is going on here right now in this country. And that is, how much does my right to embrace my culture or live as I want to, how much is that guarantee of rights a guarantee that other people must respect my rights? Can you impose this equality? And how much can you impose this equality? So, moving on here, let's talk about secularization. Now, secularization, again, if you're a fundamentalist, you might see secularization as a really, really bad thing, as if, this is some movement of hell, to bring people away from their religious roots so that they can be spiritually destroyed. But to look at it from another point of view, secularization is the reason that you can hold whatever religious beliefs you want today, worship as you wish, as long as you're not breaking the laws of the country, and nobody can burn you at the stake or stone you in the streets. And by the way, when religion was in charge of governments, that happened a lot. So in the Enlightenment period, when we're moving away from religious control over all of society, when we're moving away from religion as the ultimate authority in society, we are also taking away religion's rights to enforce the laws of the land by extreme measures if someone doesn't agree with your religious beliefs. And I'm sure all of you have heard about witch trials and burnings of the stakes. Well, in the medieval period, there were an awful lot of people burned at the stake. And the vast majority of them really did nothing wrong except upset one of their neighbors somehow, who then accused them of, oh, I saw him out in the woods, sacrificing a cat to Satan or something. And, before you know it, they're being tortured until they finally confess, because torture hurts a lot. And after you've been through a lot of pain, you would rather confess and just get it over with and die rather than to live experiencing this pain anymore. So people normally would confess, after which they'd be burned at the stake. Now, if they did confess to their sin, there might be some idea that it would turn out better for them after they're burned at the stake, but either way, they're burned at the stake, so others might fear. And by the way, in a society like this, the average person is not going, that's not fair, how do you know he did it? No, people are not thinking like that. When I see them dragging away my neighbor first thing in the morning because they have figured out that my neighbor is a Satanist, I'm thanking God. Oh, thank you, God, that, they figured out that this person was serving the devil before he could hurt me or my children. This was just such an accepted idea, that the devil was in your neighbor or was in people that you didn't know. And all of life was trying to figure out where the devil was at and, burn those people at the stake that either, supported that or, maybe embodied it. So secularization is the reason that this kind of stuff isn't happening anymore. And by the way, the beginning of our country, it was still happening in some places, as you probably know. So secularization is not a bad thing. It's the reason you can believe whatever you want to believe, and you're not going to suffer any harm or reparations as a result of it. So secularization is a good thing. Now, again, if you're a fundamentalist, you see secularization as taking the right of religion away, the right to discipline people for not believing the right thing or not embracing the right religious practices. But that's exactly what pluralism is all about, is that everybody is guaranteed that they can worship as they choose or not worship if they choose not to worship. So let's talk about secularization here. First of all, secularization is the general turning away from the traditional idea that religion is the ultimate authority in society. In ancient societies, religion was the center and everything kind of revolved around it. This was the ultimate authority that even in the social structure, even in the legislative structure, religion legitimated that. Religion somehow said, this is according to God's will, or this is the way that God has set it up. And today, of course, that is not the case. Religion is not at the center of society. Certainly some fundamentalists would like it to be at the center of society again. And those who have a better understanding of history realize that that would be a very dangerous thing if the laws of this land could be used to enforce religious orthodoxy and could be used to sentence people to punishments for not embracing the right religious beliefs or actions. So again, turning away from this traditional religious authority. So any tendency in modern society that devalues religious worldviews or seeks to subjugate them to what it considers higher knowledge, like scientific knowledge, things that can be observed in the universe, wants to elevate that above religious beliefs and say, look, you can believe whatever you want to. If you want to believe the earth was made in 6 days, you can do that. But the public schools are not going to be teaching that. The public schools are going to be teaching what we consider to be the highest understanding of what is. And now, one of the very, very important things here in secularization is the separation of church and state. And this involves, well, the emancipation of society and culture from ecclesiastical control. That's what we were just talking about. Religion doesn't control society. The decline of the influence of religious institutions in societies is a part of this. And also the separation of private morality and religious belief from governmental control. The government cannot tell you how to be religious, just like religious people can't tell the government what it should be. So this is what we mean by the separation of church and state, and this is a big part of it. Now, what we're really talking about here is the marginalization of religion. This is a big part of secularization. When you talk about something being marginalized, think of it as being pushed to the margins. Remember how religion used to be the central authority in society, and everything kind of revolved around that, and religion legitimated things or challenged things, but it was the central authority that could not be challenged, could not be violated. Well, that's certainly not the way it is now. Religion has been relegated to the margins, just like every other institution in society. It's become a single department, if you will, in society along many others. So it's no longer the central anchor or authority in society. It's been relegated to the margins where it must compete autonomously in the marketplace alongside everything else that's promoting a philosophy, selling a product, or campaigning for support. I'm going to say that one more time because I want you to get this. Religion today has been pushed to the margins. It has to compete autonomously in the marketplace of human opinion, as well as commerce and everything else. It has to compete along everything else that is promoting a philosophy. Religion is promoting its philosophy, saying this is what you ought to believe. But you have many other philosophies promoting their philosophy, saying this is what you ought to believe. You ought to trust in science, or you ought to trust in this. And the same kind of thing in terms of, you can look at it as selling a product. Everybody is trying to sell some kind of product, and religion is too. Because if you embrace a particular religion, the idea is you're going to support it, you're going to put money into it, the religion will survive because it has financial support, it has membership, it has people that still consider it relevant, but it can't force you to believe anything. It can't force you to do anything. All it can do is say, it can say, God wants you to do this, but there's no teeth behind it. If you look at the fundamentalist preacher and say, sorry, I don't believe that, you can turn around and walk away, and nobody can stone you, and nobody can burn you at the stake. Religion only has as much authority as people give it. And this is something, of course, that very much bothers fundamentalists. They would like to have the, as I said, they would like to have the teeth to be able to enforce this belief that you are supposed to adhere to enforce these practices that you are supposed to adhere to. So this is what we mean by marginalization, being pushed to the margins and, competing autonomously against any other institution that is seeking your support, seeking for you to embrace their philosophy or buy their product or anything like that. So what this does to us in our attitude of religion is it kind of makes us more like the gods, or at least like an employer, thinking about whether I'm going to hire a god. I mean, if I become part of a certain religion or a certain denomination or sect, and what was promised to me doesn't happen, or what I've expected the benefits to be don't materialize, I can say, later for you, First Baptist, I'm going to go down the street to First Methodist because, I like what they're preaching better. Or maybe you can leave an entire religion and say, sorry, Christianity, I like some of these ideas that I'm hearing, in Buddhism. Or you can just say, you know what? I don't think anything that any of you are preaching holds water. There's probably a God, but I don't think any of you have any idea who he is or what he is. And I'm just going to be spiritual in my individual personal way. And that is very much a mark of our society today. The book does make a point in saying that marginalizing religion doesn't mean that you're destroying it at all, but it leaves it up to people what they will be a part of. And more people today are choosing to be spiritual on their own terms rather than fully endorsing the belief structure of a particular religion. And that implies, of course, fully embracing the religion means that you're going to be submitted to it, in submission to it. And you are going to put yourself under the authority of the religion. And because today people have they have the right to look at different religious ideas and critique them, they're in the driver's seat. If a religion works for them, they can embrace it. But if it doesn't, I'll just be spiritual in my own way. I think God exists, and I'll just worship God in my own way. And you guys have heard this whole this statement so many times. I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious. And again, this means someone acknowledges that there is some higher reality, that they're somehow experiencing some connection to it, or seeking to experience some connection to it, believing that it's possible to experience some connection to it, and believing that there is a great benefit that comes from experiencing that connection to that which is beyond us. This is spirituality. But without any religion having the authority over us to tell us what to do, to tell us what to think, or to somehow scold us or punish us if we don't do or think those things. So I wouldn't say that people are becoming less spiritual necessarily, but they're definitely becoming less religious, if religious means submitting yourself to the authority of some kind of a religious organization. Hopefully that makes sense. So anyway, separation of church and state, this is a big part of it. This means that the state, the government, cannot control your religious views, your private morality, your religious belief. It works the other way around too. Religion cannot control the government and tell the government what kind of laws to make and how to enforce those laws in such a way that the people that believe as them get some kind of greater benefit or some kind of greater tolerance. So separation of church and state, the state doesn't control the church doesn't control the state. There's a lot of disagreement about that today, of course. Those who think, the fundamentalists would say that, no. When the forefathers set this up, when they said the separation of church and state, what they were saying was that, the state cannot control our religion. The state cannot tell us what is right, what is wrong, but religion is supposed to control the state. And I think this represents, certainly a convenient understanding for the fundamentalists. But if you look at the history of those who came from Europe over here, and you look at the kind of religious oppression that they were fleeing from and that they were rejecting, you are looking at religious factions trying to, control the government, if you will. England's a great example where you've got the Catholics against the Protestants, against, whatever. And but also when a religion certainly is the religion of the king or of the government, and it is imposed on everybody else in the society, then the people in the society that believe something different are, of course, disadvantaged. And a lot of them were the ones that fled, the Puritans and so on, coming over to this country so that they could have religious freedom as they wished. But they understood that this could only happen when government does not have the power to enforce religion. Fundamentalists today do not accept that interpretation really at all. They say that they came over here because they wanted to be able to control the government with their religion. And separation of church and state just means that you can't have a state that has power over the church to control the church. But if you tell them it means that the church shouldn't be able to control the state, at that point they will differ with you. Now, one thing about a democracy, and technically we're a republic, but I don't want to get into political differences here, but technically with a democracy, if religion wants to, a particular religion or particular way of thinking wants to control a government, all they have to do is get a majority of votes, and they can do that. So if a majority of people said, yes, we want a law that says, abortion is not permitted, then the government should be able to pass a law like that if a majority of people vote for it. But once you get to the point where those who are part of the religious fundamentalism are no longer a majority of society, that is, the ones who want to impose their religious views are no longer a majority of society, then I'm sorry, it's not going to happen. And the book talks about the fact that many fundamentalist religious movements have to do with trying to revitalize the control of traditional religion over society that they see has, kind of going to hell in a handbasket, to quote the phrase here. And so fundamentalist movements, or you might call them traditionalist movements, are trying to get back to this how should we say, this idea that certain religious views are inviolable, and the government should enforce that those religious views are not violated. So hopefully this all concurs with what you've understood in your reading of the book here so far. So the First Amendment of the American Constitution stresses both secularity and religious freedom. Secular, the government is not going to be run by religious viewpoints, but the government also is not going to curtail your right to be religious in whatever way that you want to be religious. And that's what we mean by the separation of church and state. The fact that religion no longer plays a central role in legitimating the social order, that's what we mean by the marginalization of religion. And again, that is a major part of secularization. Now, some of the things that challenge religious viewpoints, first of all, we have the idea of social justice. And when we talk about social justice, we're talking about the fact that there are people who are disadvantaged in society, and we believe that society has the responsibility somehow to level the playing field, that somehow the advantages of those who have more should be used to increase the quality of life of those who have less. I mean, rich people should pay higher taxes. There should be social service programs for poorer people who have not had the same opportunity. A lot of religious fundamentalists reject this, and when you come right out and say this, a lot of people will bristle, but the idea is that, gee, if you were religious in the same way that I was religious, you would not have this disadvantage. You wouldn't make less money. You know, you'd be just as successful as I am if you believed like I do, which is saying that for those who are in a good position, my religion is the reason I'm in a good position, and the reason you're not is because you don't believe what I believe. And so therefore the bad position that you're in is the result of your own rejection of religion or rejection of God. And, I'm under no obligation, to change the rules, of who God blesses and who God doesn't. That's a very typical fundamentalist attitude, at least among those who are, socioeconomically in a much more favorable position. And so it's funny because when you think of social justice, if you completely divorce that from any current issue and you just look at the words, everybody would say, well, yes, I'm in favor of justice in society, and that's all social justice is. I'm in favor of justice in society. But when you start saying that people in society that are a different color than you, a different race than you, a different religion than you, or no religion at all, who don't have the same education as you, haven't been as successful as you, that somehow you have to take your money, your advantage, and some of it has to go to improve their lives, that's when fundamentalists often bristle and say, no. If they accepted the Lord and they worship the Lord the way I do, then God would take care of their problem. So ethical evolution and social justice is something that's very much argued about. Should, homosexuals who want to get married have the same right to get married that heterosexuals have? Fundamentalists generally say, no, not at all. This is not a right that's guaranteed by God. And they, of course, can cite many scriptures about the perversion of homosexuality. And, of course, they're not really understanding the context of the scriptures. But I'm not going to get into that right now. That'll be a discussion for another day, perhaps. I guess we can move on here to scientific advancements. Now, one of the things that fundamentalists, in fact, this is where the name actually came from, is the rejection of new methods of historical research or analysis, and new scientific advancements and new understandings of the world that disagree with the traditional religious understanding. So, for instance, the idea that the world was created in 6 literal 24-hour days, and the creation was finished about 6,000 years ago. Now, science today knows that our particular Earth here is about 4.6 billion years old, I think is the current consensus. And anatomically, modern humans have been around maybe 500,000 years. And of course, this doesn't square with the 6,000 years that the whole world has been around according to the story in Genesis, with Adam and Eve being the first human beings. Adam is cultivating a garden. That's domestic agriculture. And we talked a little bit about the agricultural revolution. So if Adam and Eve lived 6,000 years ago, well, in that regard, it's very historical, because 6,000 years ago, we're in the Neolithic period where people are domesticating agriculture. So to say that Adam was taking care of a garden works fine. Adam's two sons, Cain and Abel. Cain is actually a farmer, and Abel seems to be a rancher, a pastoralist. This is domestic agriculture. So this fits perfectly 6,000 years ago. But if you want to say that this is the first couple, you've got all kinds of problems, from the geologic record to everything else, and just simple problems. If Adam and Eve had two sons, Cain and Abel, and Cain killed Abel, and then they had a third son named Seth, and they all go and get wives and have children. Where did the wives come from? So, we do have some problems here with that. And with all of the different remains of anatomically modern humans and, hominids before that, from Neanderthals to Denisovians and, Homo habilis and Homo erectus. I mean, all of these different, varieties, if you will, of two-legged humans walking around that go back, so many hundreds of thousands of years. What does the religious fundamentalists say? Well, one of the things that is very often heard is that somehow modern science is a deception of Satan, that everything that we've learned how to see about reality is somehow Satan deceiving our minds. And the people that are really correct are the ones that will not even reason about these things. They just keep repeating the literal text in Genesis 1 and 2 and 3, and they say that's it. And so they claim the inerrancy of the scriptures. In other words, the scriptures are not just true in terms of the ethical example that they offer, which can be very helpful to us in making decisions in life. But no, they're saying the scriptures are true historically and scientifically. So they're saying that in history, the entire universe is like 6,000 years old, almost. And scientifically, yes, it was all created by God in the order it says in Genesis 1 in 6 literal days. And they will not depart from that view. To depart from that view, they feel like is leaving their religion, is turning their back on God. And so they develop their own communities, and they teach their own children these things. And the book points out there's a big conflict that's been going on for decades in the schools about whether or not you can teach the religious ideas of creationism in the schools. And the book tells you a little bit about the history of some of the conflicts, which I won't go into here. Certainly, the religions can have their own private schools, and they can teach their students whatever they want. But the two questions that continue to be dealt with in different situations are, first of all, how much can these private religious groups count on government funding? And again, maybe the government is not giving money right to the schools, but we see that a lot of people believe in what they call vouchers, which means that whatever educational benefit you are supposed to have based on the taxes you pay to society and so on, if you choose not for that money not to go to a secular public school, that you should be able to divert that money to some kind of a private religious school. And this is a matter of huge debate, obviously. And the second major point of debate is in the public schools. How much can religion, force the public schools to teach the alternate theories of creationism right next to Darwinian evolution, for instance? And so these are the big areas of conflict here. And this brings me, maybe I should have done this first, but it seemed to work better to deal with it last, okay? This brings us to the term fundamentalism itself. Fundamentalism actually started referring to something a lot more specific, and the word has been very much expanded to refer to any kind of a traditional religious movement to try to revitalize those traditional views in the midst of a society that is becoming much more modernized much more dependent on science and technology, much more embracing of the ideas of social justice and multiculturalism and pluralism, much more committed to the idea of the separation of church and state. Fundamentalism rejects all of that and fights against that. Now, the term first came about, and you can read about this in your book, and you can very easily look up and find more about the history of it if you'd like, and if you'd like some articles to read, let me know. But fundamentalists were a group of Christians in the late 19th and early 20th centuries who organized to fight certain aspects of modernity that they, of course, saw as an evil force in the world. And two of the major issues that they were embracing when they first came about was, first of all, Darwinian evolution, because that flew in the face of the Earth has been around 6,000 years, and Adam and Eve were the first humans and all of that. Very much against Darwinian evolution or any kind of acceptance of evolution. And again, that's not really the case today. Many religious people have accepted the idea that there's some kind of evolution, and basically they say, hey, God can create any way he wants to. If he wants to create the Earth and all of the things in it over 4.6 billion years, he's God, he can do whatever he wants. But the main thing today that people would object to is the idea of random selection, the idea that there was no God involved, that there was no plan, that God was not in charge of the process. That's the main thing that they would object to. But back, 100 years ago, anything that fell under this canopy of evolutionism, they were flatly against, and went way out of their way to create propaganda, that's kind of a negative term, to publish their ideas. And the second thing that really bothered them was what we call historical critical methods in religious studies. And that's not exactly the term that the book uses, though it does talk about the historical method in religious studies, but we usually call it the historical critical method. And this had been really kind of taken off for a century or two at the time, but it had gotten to the point to where a lot of the traditional ideas, especially in Christianity, were being challenged by this historical critical method. And so what happened is fundamentalist religion doubled down on the idea of the inerrancy of the scriptures and refused to acknowledge anything that sought to see how the scriptures might have developed over time, or how different documents might have been put together to make one. There's all kinds of different areas of modern scholarship which have been very helpful in understanding religious history, by the way. But these ideas of modern scholarship, they flatly reject. So again, these historical critical methods in religious studies scholarship, and the belief in Darwinian evolution, obviously a world much older than the 6,000 years. They see these as last days movements of evil in the world, designed to pull people away from the faith so that they can be destroyed very soon when the end of the world comes. Which brings us to another aspect here, and I don't have it up on the board here, sorry about this, but I usually talk about it as apocalypticism, but in our country, the main form of it is often called millenarianism or millennialism. Predispensational millennialism is a big one. But millenarianism believes the scriptures that there's going to come a final battle between good and evil after a 7-year horrible tribulation period. And after this battle, when God and his forces have overthrown the devil and his forces, then Jesus is going to come to earth and reign for 1,000 years. Additionally, some groups believe that at the beginning of this tribulation period, there's going to be a rapture of all of the faithful at that time, so they don't have to go through this horrible tribulation period where this evil ruler called the Antichrist is going to be revealed, and the world is going to be very horrible for 7 years. Others believe in not a pre-tribulation rapture, but a mid-tribulation rapture, where halfway through this tribulation period, people are caught up to heaven. But the idea is, once again, after this final battle between good and evil here, Christ is going to come and reign for 1,000 years, and that's why we call it millenarianism, because that's 1,000 years. Now, the book doesn't tell you this, but millenarianism actually has a second chapter, and that is at the end of the 1,000 years, there's a second battle between good and evil, conclusive battle, And at this final battle, then actually God creates a whole new heaven and a whole new earth. So, and there's many different variations, by the way, of these different kind of apocalyptic teachings. But the book points out one of the main ones in American Protestant Christian fundamentalism is this millenarian theology. So back to the term fundamentalism. This originally referred to the people that were fighting, again, at the late 19th, early 20th century, fighting against Darwinian evolution and historical critical methods in religious studies. And they published a series of booklets or pamphlets called The Fundamentals of the Christian Faith. And so they got the term fundamentalists. Now, the question is, should that term just define that particular movement in Christianity, that historically began a little over a century ago, or should the meaning of the term fundamentalism, the definition of the term fundamentalism, be expanded to include any kind of a religious revitalization movement that's trying to get back to traditional ideas of orthodoxy within societies that are evolving ethically in terms of social justice, accepting scientific advancements, embracing multiculturalism, guaranteeing equal rights for those who believe very, very differently. We have, of course, have this kind of a conflict going on all over the world in different religions and different nations. And so the author of your book here falls in the category of those that is taking the term fundamentalism and using it to refer to any other kind of conflict in any other country that kind of resembles that same conflict of tradition against modernity. Now, again, the whole question here is if you see the development of society as being a positive thing or a negative thing. The idea that everybody should have equal rights, I personally see as a positive thing. The idea that if you believe the wrong thing, people can't imprison you for it or burn you at the stake, I personally see that as a positive thing too. But not everybody does. And so this is what the author is doing, is he is using fundamentalism in the expanded application here. And he uses it to refer to different things in the book. Like he gives you an example of Wahhabist movements in Sunni Islam coming out of Saudi Arabia. He gives you an example of Shiite movements coming out of Iran, and he says that the same kind of formula is happening here, which is kind of a doubling down of religious fundamentalisms, religious fundamentalists rejecting this modernization of society. They see it as an evil thing, and so it's always about who's going to win. Is it going to be about those that have the more modern, evolved viewpoints of what is just, or is it going to be the older traditionalists or fundamentalists who want to have authority to curtail and punish and censor all of those that don't believe the way they believe? And so, again, the author has expanded the term to relate to that, as we said. Now, the book gives you a number of examples of fundamentalism here. American Protestant fundamentalism, which we're just talking about, is the origin of the term. And it talks about Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson, who I've actually mentioned in different discussions regarding theisms, and the idea that they feel like they can explain historical events as the will of God. Jerry Falwell, of course, is famous for saying that 9/11 happened because God removed his protection from us and allowed it to happen because he was mad at us for gay marriage and abortion and things like that. And Pat Robertson also tried to explain the earthquakes in Haiti as having something to do with God removing his protection because the government had made a deal with Satan or some crazy thing. Again, these are people who want everything to be understood as somehow having to do with the battle of good and evil. And when tragedies happen, it's usually because God is mad and he's letting them happen to punish us, so we will come back to God. And this is something that you hear an awful lot. It also talks about contemporary Islamic fundamentalism. And as I mentioned before, it talks about Wahhabism in Sunni, and it talks about the revolution when the Shah of Iran was kicked out and Ayatollah Khomeini came back as the leader of Iran during Jimmy Carter's presidency. And I'm not going to talk about that now, but you can read about what the book says about these different things here. And the book goes on and then talks about Osama bin Laden, who comes out of the Sunni Wahhabist type of movement here, and talks about 9/11. And one of the things that the book points out, that I'll just mention here real quickly, is that in all of these fundamentalist movements, they are identifying who the enemy is. For Islamist extremists, America itself is the great Satan. And certainly in our country, we've seen a number of presidents that have referred to, the axis of evil or something like that. So we're seeing this, if we're fundamentalists, as some kind of a spiritual battle. And those who are against us, we're identifying as associated with Satan or the forces of Satan or evil on earth that God wants to destroy. So the book does point that out as well. Now, another thing I'll mention here is that this book, I don't know if you've ever looked at the inside cover of a book, but I do. And the last copyright on this book is 2009. However, this book has not been substantially updated since the update after 9/11, 2001, where the story of 9/11 was added to this chapter, because obviously at that point it was the greatest example of religious fundamentalism involved in terrorist action that we'd seen recently. So this was all added to the book shortly after 9/11 happened. It was almost like immediately, we got to get this in the book. But even though the book has been recopyrighted at least a couple times since then, there have been no major changes to it since then. So the book is very dated. Now, as you're going through the book, just a heads up here, keep your eyes open for things that might indicate to you how dated the book is. And at the end of the quiz, I may have like an extra credit question. I think I will. Just asking you if you could identify a couple things in the chapter that make it clear that this book has not been updated in a few years and certainly should. So just kind of pay attention to that. The book we were using before this at PHSC, which is not a bad book either, but actually its final update was even earlier than this one. Anyway, just pointing that out here. You're looking at a viewpoint here, probably late 2001, early 2002, and you don't see much understanding in the book of things that have happened since then. So keep your eyes open for that. Now, so finally, what did we go over here? We talked about multiculturalism and pluralism. We talked about the marginalization of religion and secularization. We talked about modernization and urbanization, again, where the majority of the population is engaged in industrial and service occupations, not agriculture. A majority of people are living in urban areas rather than rural areas. We have a market-driven economy and a government bureaucracy. Scientific and technological innovation is expected and encouraged. We're looking for technology to make our lives better. And one aspect I didn't mention before, actually, I wanted to bring out here, is we don't see the same kind of households with multiple generations of extended family living together. In the agricultural, when the majority of the population was agricultural, we saw a lot more of that, multiple generations of family living together. And there are many nations on earth, even in fact in urban areas, there are other nations where multiple generations of family live together in the same place. But not so much with modernization in this country. And by the way, that really took off after World War II. We had a new idea, a new ideal of the nuclear family. And this doesn't mean nuclear power or nuclear bombs, but the nuclear family means the nucleus of the family is the father, the mother, and the children, who ideally you've got 2 or 3. And this is what success looks like. And so, if you're like 30 and you're still living with your parents, it's like, no, you're a loser. And but in other countries, someone who would leave their home at 18 or 19 just to assert their independence because it looks like success would be shamed. I mean, why do you leave your family and not recognize your obligation to be a blessing to them? Now, if you have to move far away to get income and you're going to send money home to take care of them, that's fine. I mean, if there's a reason, but you don't just move away your family just to demonstrate that, oh, I'm independent and I'm successful because I'm independent. And but that's what happened in this country. And many times when multiple generations live in the same household, there are some people today that still look down on that as some kind of a failure. So that's one of the things that changed with modernization. Is that multiple generations of extended family don't live together the way they used to. And I think that's what I've got here. Now you can go ahead and again, read through the book yourself as far as the different examples that they give you about this, about fundamentalism in the broader term in Sunni Islam, in Shia Islam. And I think I've covered everything I'm going to have on the quiz. The quiz is not going to be that long of a quiz, and the questions are going to be asked much more about these concepts that I have explained to you than the individual examples that have been given in the book. I mean, know the examples, but I'm less concerned about the examples that have been given because some of them are kind of dated anyway, and there's some better ones, more recent ones that should have been given. But I really do want you to understand these concepts, and you do really have to understand these concepts to even get involved in this conversation about the conflict between traditionalism and modernity, or between fundamentalism and secularization, if you want to look at it that way. All right, see you next time.